For 7 years, I rang those bells every single morning. And every single morning, I prayed that no one would ever look up. Because if they had, if even one soldier, one inspector, one curious child had climbed those stone steps and pushed open that door, we both would have been dead before sunset. I kept the most hunted man on earth hidden inside my church's bell tower. And I would do it again. If you stay with me until the end of this story, you will understand exactly why. You will understand the choice I made, what it cost me, and why I am only now able to speak about it out loud. To understand why I opened that hidden door, you have to understand who I was before any of this happened. I was 31 years old. I had been a nun for 9 years. My life was quiet, structured, and small, and I loved it that way. I woke before sunrise every morning. I prayed. I cleaned. I taught the youngest children in the village how to read. I helped the elderly women carry water. I wrapped bandages. I listened to people cry. That was my whole world, and I believed with everything inside me that it was exactly the world God had designed for me. I was not brave. I was not political. I was not exceptional. I was just a woman who had chosen a simple life of service inside a stone church at the edge of a small mountain town. But the world outside that church was not quiet. It was fracturing. The political situation in our region had been deteriorating for years. There were factions, loyalties, betrayals. A resistance movement had grown underground, and the government, backed by foreign military support, had declared war on it. Not a quiet war, a brutal one. Raids happened at night. People disappeared. Entire families were relocated without explanation. The soldiers who came through our town were not the kind you argued with. They had lists. They had orders. And they were looking for one man above everyone else. His name was spoken in whispers. Some people called him a terrorist. Others called him a revolutionary. The government had placed a reward on his capture so large that people in our village stopped trusting their own neighbors. Bounty hunters were coming in from 3 different countries. I had heard his name, of course. Everyone had. But I had never imagined that name would ever have anything to do with me. Then one night in November, someone knocked on the church's back door. It was past midnight. I was the only one awake. I remember standing there in the dark hallway, holding a small candle, telling myself not to open it. But the knocking didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone who had barely enough strength left to lift their hand. I opened the door. He fell against the doorframe. He was bleeding from his side, soaked from the rain, shaking so badly I thought he was having a seizure. He looked at me with these eyes, exhausted, terrified, desperate, and he said only 3 words. He said, "Please don't scream." I didn't scream. I don't know why. I just stood there, staring at him, and something inside me shifted. Because underneath the blood and the mud and the fear, I saw something I recognized. I saw a man who was absolutely certain he was about to die. I pulled him inside. I didn't know who he was yet. Not that night. I cleaned his wound, gave him water, and hid him in the storage room behind the altar. It wasn't until 2 days later, when soldiers came door to door through the village showing photographs, that I realized exactly who was lying injured in my church. My hands were shaking so badly when I closed the church door behind the soldiers that I had to press them flat against the wood just to hold myself steady. I went back to the storage room. I looked at him. And I said, "I know who you are." He said, "Then you should turn me in." I stood there for a long time in complete silence. Everything I had been taught told me that harboring a fugitive was a sin against the law, possibly against God, certainly against every instinct of self-preservation I had. He was accused of terrible things. People had died. He had been labeled a monster by the government and a martyr by others, and I honestly did not know which version was true. But I knew this. He was wounded, he was alone, and he was in my church. And I could not bring myself to hand a dying man to people who would execute him before morning. I told him he could not stay where he was. The soldiers would come back. They always came back. I thought about it for almost an entire day, pacing the chapel, praying harder than I had ever prayed in my life, asking God for a sign or at least for clarity. And then I looked up. Literally up. At the bell tower. No one went up there except me. The bells were on an automated mechanism that had been installed years before. The upper chamber was technically sealed off. There was a small wooden door behind the main staircase that most people didn't even know existed. The chamber itself was narrow, dusty, and cold, but it had a small window that let in air and a stone floor large enough for one person to lie down on. It was invisible from the outside. And it was the last place anyone would ever search. That night, I helped him climb those stairs. I want to be honest about what the next 7 years actually felt like, because it was not heroic. It was exhausting in a way that hollowed me out from the inside. Every single day was a performance. I rang the bells. I taught the children. I smiled at the soldiers when they walked past. I answered questions calmly. I volunteered nothing. And every night after the church went dark, I climbed those stairs with whatever food I had managed to set aside: bread, dried fruit, sometimes a small piece of meat, and I slid it through that door. We talked. Not at first. At first there was only silence and suspicion. But over months, we began to talk. He told me about his childhood, about the choices that had led him here, about the things he regretted and the things he still believed in. I told him about my faith, about my doubts, about the moments I wondered whether God was even listening. He was not the monster the government described. He was also not entirely the saint his followers believed. He was complicated and human and deeply afraid. And he had been carrying enormous guilt for years. There were close calls. So many close calls. In the second year, a government inspector stayed in our church for 3 days conducting what he called a full property assessment. I watched him walk to the base of the staircase twice. Both times, I found a reason to pull his attention somewhere else. I still don't know how I appeared calm. Inside, I was absolutely falling apart. In the 4th year, one of the older sisters began asking questions. She had noticed that I was always the last one awake and that food was disappearing in ways she couldn't account for. I told her I had been feeding a stray dog that came to the back door at night. She believed me. I hated lying to her. I hated it more than almost anything else during those years. In the 6th year, he became very sick. A deep chest infection that I was terrified would take him before any soldier ever could. I had to source medicine quietly, through a contact in a neighboring village, without explaining why I needed it. The night his fever finally broke, I sat on the stone floor of that bell tower and cried for the first time in years. Not because I was relieved. Because I suddenly realized that I genuinely cared whether he lived. And then came the night I had always known would eventually arrive. Someone had talked. I don't know who. I don't know whether it was an accident or a deliberate betrayal. But soldiers arrived at the church just after midnight, 12 of them, with orders to conduct an immediate full-scale search. Not a routine visit. A real search. With flashlights. With dogs. With specific instructions to check every room, every closet, every structure on the property. I was standing in the main chapel when they came through the door. The commanding officer looked at me and said they had received information that the fugitive might be inside the church. My whole body went cold. I said nothing for a moment. And then I made a decision. I told them that I had heard rumors too. I told them that someone had actually tried to break into the church 2 weeks earlier, that I had reported it and nobody had come. I expressed frustration. I invited them to search. I walked with them through every room. I opened every door myself. I was calm in a way I still cannot explain. When we reached the base of the bell tower staircase, I pointed up and told them the upper chamber had been structurally condemned for years and that the access door was bolted shut from the outside. The commanding officer aimed his flashlight up the stairs, stood there for several seconds, and then turned away. They left at dawn. Empty-handed. I climbed those stairs on shaking legs. I pushed open the door. He was pressed against the far wall, completely still, holding his breath. We looked at each other and neither of us said a single word. 3 months later, the political situation changed dramatically. The faction that had been hunting him lost its government backing. Arrests were made at very high levels. The reward on his life was quietly removed. And in the chaos of that political collapse, I helped him leave. A different country, a different name, a different life. He walked out of that church in ordinary clothes on an ordinary morning, and I never saw him again. I received one letter, about a year later. It said only, "I am building something new. Thank you for believing I was worth saving." I read that letter so many times the paper eventually fell apart along the folds. People ask me sometimes whether I believe what I did was right. And I always pause before answering because I think that pause is the most honest part of my response. I broke the law. I deceived people I loved. I endangered my entire community. I lied inside a house of God. And I would be dishonest if I told you I have never lost sleep over that. I have questioned everything. I have prayed through more nights than I can count asking whether mercy and justice are always supposed to look the same, and I have never received a clean, simple answer. What I do know is this. I was given a choice between following a rule and following my conscience. Between turning away a wounded human being and offering him shelter. I chose shelter. I chose mercy. I chose to believe that every life contains the possibility of something more than its worst moment. That is what my faith actually means to me, even when it costs everything. 7 years. Every morning bell. Every quiet prayer. Every careful lie. Every sleepless night. Every impossible choice. That is the secret I carried inside that bell tower. And now you know. I want to ask you something honestly. If that door had knocked on your night, if that bleeding stranger had looked at you with those exhausted eyes, what would you have done? Would you have chosen safety? Would you have chosen law? Or would you have opened the door? Leave your answer in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know, and I think you might surprise yourself when you actually think it through. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please share it. Someone out there is facing an impossible choice right now, and maybe they need to hear that ordinary people sometimes do extraordinary things not because they are fearless, but because they are faithful.